Welcome to the Manufacturing Matters podcast with the Council of Industry. Join us as we bring you inspiring stories, interviews, and insights from across the Hudson Valley that will revolutionize the way you think about manufacturing. This podcast is proudly sponsored by PKF O'Connor Davies, a leading accounting and advisory firm dedicated to helping businesses thrive in the manufacturing sector. With their industry knowledge and strategic guidance, PKF O'Connor Davies ensures that manufacturers have the financial insights and support they need to achieve success.
Steve Pomeroy, President, Schatz Bearing Corporation. Welcome to the Council of Industry podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Terrific. So, Schatz Bearing Corporation, Poughkeepsie, New York. Tell us a little bit about the company, what you guys make, who you sell it to.
Okay, we make ball bearings, and the first thing I'll say is that the idea for non-mechanical people of ball bearings is typically it's the ball bearing. A ball bearing has an outer ring, an inner ring, and a bunch of balls in it. It's not just a spherical metal object that people generally assume to be ball bearing. So that's what
I was one of those people that had that assumption until getting the tour some like 25 years ago. So now I know better.
Well, it gets not to get way off on a tangent, but it does get misinterpreted. I remember an ad that I think it was one of the Japanese car companies, I believe, Toyota or Honda, about their relentless pursuit of perfection, and they had what they called the ball bearing test, and they rolled a ball down the seam of I think like one of the
like it was like a Lexus or something. I remember this. Yes.
And I was like, no, don't call it the ball bearing.
It's just the ball.
It's just a ball.
That's a marble.
So anyway, we make ball bearings. I would say 3/4 of our market is for aerospace and defense. So aerospace includes aviation, so the Boeings of the world, for example, and the space angle of it also. You have NASA, and space as an industry has really exploded recently as far as activity goes. So you can't watch the news without seeing SpaceX or Blue Origin or somebody doing something of note. So we're very active in the space industry. And then defense, we do a fair amount of business with the U.S. government, DOA, DOD. And so that represents about 3/4 of our business. And the other quarter is a mix of bearing applications for semiconductor equipment, medical equipment like surgical robots, and then the applications might be just general industrial and so forth. But those are the major industries that we're in.
So those are the industries, but maybe for those of us who are ignorant about what a ball bearing actually is and its function, just to talk a little bit about how it's used in those products and what it does, but what its benefit is.
Well, it's got a whole bunch of different uses in let's say, an aircraft, for example. If you're a flyer and you walk by an aircraft, it might not look like there's a lot of moving parts to it, but there are. I mean, well, the first thing I'll say is that within aircraft, there's two kind of distinct markets for a ball bearing manufacturer. One would be for engines, and then everything else that goes into an aircraft. And we're in the everything else category.
Okay.
So it could be control services, actuators, gearboxes, auxiliary power units, those kinds of things for an aircraft. Like in a satellite application, for example, when a satellite gets launched and put into service, there's all kinds of activities that are needed to make that satellite functional. So we've been in applications, for example, like the deployment of a solar array, because that's what powers the satellite when it gets up there is solar power. So you have to kind of unfurl this array of solar panels, for lack of a better term. And so those are at least a couple examples.
That's plenty. But there's so it's obviously like a wide range of uses and components. Do you have like a standard products that people buy off the shelf, or are they custom? How does somebody procure a ball bearing?
Oh, both. That's a good question. The government, for example, has military standards. We call them MS bearings. So there's a bunch of MS standards that we make, and I would say we're approved for somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 military standard part numbers. The various OEM aircraft makers like Boeing, we are approved to a similar number of standards. So that does fuel quite a bit of our business, is just making standard parts for, either the military or the Boeing or the world. And even some companies that are not in the military might buy a bearing that you typically make. You can make it to a different part number, but it's basically the same part number. So because they're standards, I think, you get enough volume, companies they try to make as much so their designs run off standard products just to keep costs down. But I would say a good fraction of our business and growing is custom bearings. So we do make custom bearings too. So a company could come to us and say, we need this standard bearing, exactly what we want, send us this bearing, and we do. Or they might come to us with they just say, we need this bearing to withstand this load, these rotational speeds, this thermal gradient. Just give us a whole bunch of application parameters, and we design it to meet those requirements. Or we tell them, no, you can't do it that way. Try to find something else and help them with their specific application and say, well, can we do something with the surrounding infrastructure to make the bearing design possible? So we do all of that.
Talk about, if you would, a little bit about well, first of all, what pops in my head is like, what are the size ranges we're talking about? Because I know that they can be fairly small. We've got a couple of samples in our office here from you guys that are like maybe 2 inches in diameter. Talk about the size, and then if you would, talk about the process of manufacturing them and assembling them.
So size range, there's what's called a miniature market. So I don't know the exact therein. There may not be an exact cut over to what is considered miniature and not miniature, but we're anything above that. So like the smallest ID or bore, inside diameter or bore of the bearing that we make might be in the 4 millimeter range, which is 0.156 inches. And then below that is miniature ground. You can get bearings that are tiny that, before you went to solid state drives and computers, these little disk drives have little disks whirring that were all on miniature bearings.
I can still hear them whirring in my old desktop. Yes,
right.
I can.
So there are, and then, if you go to the dentist, those dental handpiece bearings are all miniature, high precision miniature bearings. They're going at 100,000 RPM or whatever those handpieces. So that's a whole different market than what we're in. So I would say 4 millimeters is the low end, and then we go up to 14 inches in diameter.
Really?
Yep.
Okay.
So we have
the inside diameter, you said?
No, that's up
to okay.
So typical, depending upon how big the cross section is of the bearing. So that's the difference between the ID and the OD, or inside diameter, outside diameter. The bore size might go up to 12, 13 inches. So you can get a pretty thin cross section doing that. And then the other thing is there's precision levels for the bearings that go from ABEC, it stands for Annual Bearing Engineering Conference, I believe, and with the ABEC rate levels of precision. So for the ABEC 1, which is the lowest level of precision bearing, up to ABEC 9. And the ABEC 9 would be things that go into machine tool spindles and so forth. We routinely go up to ABEC 7. We can do some ABEC 9 tolerances. But the ABEC 9 market is pretty saturated with competitors, so it's not something that's really pursuing that hard, at least for the standard bearings that are in that type of market.
Gotcha. But if an existing customer wanted that, you could produce it for them, so they wouldn't have to go to a competitor.
Yeah, typically, we'll do ABEC 7, and if someone says, but I need this tolerance that would be considered ABEC 9, then we'll do it. But it's not something we do on a regular basis. And it doesn't really impact at least the markets that we play in too much.
And the process, is it machining? Is it, I remember like some grinding training at some point in time. You had some precision grinding that you were doing. What does the process look like to make and assemble these?
So what we do is a bearing consists of an outer ring, an inner ring, typically balls that will fill between into the ball path or races of those rings. And then you can have a cage that keeps the balls from touching each other, keeps them evenly spaced. we do, you start out with typically a round bar, maybe 12 feet long would be common, and you machine those into lower precision rings. You heat treat those rings, and then that makes them hard, and then you do a bunch of grinding operations on them to bring them into the precision level that is needed for precision bearings. And then there's also some things that are not considered grinding. It's more along the lines of lapping, super finishing, which typically the ball path would get the honing or super finishing operation. So it's machining, heat treating, and a number of grinding operations, maybe super finishing, and that completes the rings. Balls we don't make, and it's very common for bearing companies not to make their own balls, or if they're big enough, they may buy a company that makes the balls, but with specialized making balls. So we buy the balls. Cages, we do some in-house, some we buy from companies that are stamping houses, which are, because a number of cages, the cages can be made out of strip steel, or it could be nylon. There's phenolic cages. There's a number of different materials you can make the ball separators in. And then could be seals or shields on the outside to keep the grease in and the contamination out. So we do some of that manufacturing, and we also source that out. And then the final operation for all of that is to put all those together in our assembly department, which we do all the assembly for the bearings.
That is interesting. So typically in these conversations, I will say something like, well, you didn't grow up wanting to make ball bearings, but I think that might be an exception in your case.
Well,
tell me, how'd you get in this business?
Well, it's kind of funny. I have two angles to that question. One is, no, I did not think that this was what I was going to be doing. When I got out of high school, I went to college and I started studying electrical engineering. And my parents got involved in this company while I was an undergraduate, or maybe just in graduate school. And when they first presented me with this opportunity, it was really not what I was. I don't know, you don't study electrical engineering to get into ball bearing.
Right. Fair enough.
And my dad did not start or get involved in this company early in his career. It was late in his career. And so over a couple of years of coming home for holidays and so forth, and they would tell me what was going on with the business, they kind of said, well, my dad was planning on retiring within a handful of years. And he said, and he knew I was interested, because even when I was studying electrical engineering, I was interested in small business, interested in doing something entrepreneurial. And he said, you won't get the opportunity to learn how to run a small business from someone who is as dedicated and focused on your success as your dad would be.
That's true.
And so they convinced me, and so I made a deal with them. I said, I'll finish my graduate degree, because I ideally it would have been better for me to, even if I had planned to go to a company business, it would have been better for me to go work for another company,
right?
Understand some management processes from somewhere else. Ideally it would be from a company that had really good management, and see what they, and then bring that experience with me. But my dad was too close to retirement. He said, I'm not going to do this forever. You either come now, and so I made it for them. I said, I'll finish my degree, because a number of people where I was did not finish because they just couldn't finish. So I wanted to, basically for my own, I guess, satisfaction.
I sense your modesty where you were, because you were at MIT. So it's
so there are a number of people at MIT that couldn't finish. This is to get a PhD, you have to have original research and so forth. So it's not easy. So I wanted to finish it for that reason, but I also wanted to have, because I said to my dad, if this is not my thing, I want to be able to, within a couple of years, the technology changes so quickly, it gets stale. So you can't take 10 years off and just say, I'm going to jump right back in. So I told him I'll give it a year or two, and if it's not for me, I'm not staying. And he agreed with that, because he was at the end of his career. He would have probably just sold, and that would have been the end of it. But here I am 35 years later, and
still plugging away.
Right, still going.
So talk a little bit about kind of the origin of Schatz. I mean, Schatz Bearing Corporation, because you're not the same as the facility that's been in Poughkeepsie, or was in Poughkeepsie for the better part of a century, near your location. But talk about the companies and how your dad came to acquire it.
So this is information that was fed to me. Obviously, I wasn't there
Right.
from all those years, but from what I understand, a fellow by the name of Adolf Schatz came over from Germany, started what I think was called Schatz Manufacturing Company at the time. I think it was in the late 1800s, and they did some sort of manufacturing that I'm not aware of, but I think sometime in the early 1900s, they started making ball bearings. And by the 19 teens, they recognized that automotive was, that's when cars first started kind of coming on the scene, and they recognized that was a potential really big market. So they started Federal Bearings, which was focused primarily on the automotive market. I think they ran the two companies separately for a while, and then at some point they merged it into one company called Schatz Federal. And the Schatz side did aerospace and agricultural, I think some other things, and I think the Federal Bearing was mostly automotive. And then they peaked in employment in World War II time frame of, I think, like 1,200 people, which is a good sized company at any time, but in the 1940s in Poughkeepsie, it rivaled IBM in size and
Sure.
and then, like a lot of American manufacturing, I think it had its heyday in the aftermath of World War II, where there was not a lot of foreign competition. My dad used to joke that manufacturing in the U.S. at that time frame is like a license to steal. Like you could pretty much do any business practice and be successful.
Yeah, that is true.
And but then in the 70s, there was I think a combination of factors. Again, this is information that was passed on.
Sure.
We don't have a union now, but they did have a union then, and the union management relationship was poor. I think probably understated. The foreign competition started to come in, and I think management at the time made some strategic errors about what markets to approach or target, and the combination of all those three factors, the old Schatz Federal went out of business in 1979 timeframe. And then this company, they had an auction of assets in that time frame, and their plan was just to sell off the equipment and be done with it. But at that auction, there were former employees of the Schatz Federal, and there was a guy there that they kind of talked into, don't just buy the equipment, you can restart it and just focus in on aerospace and maybe one or two other industries and make a go of it. And this guy decided to go do it. And he did it for a few years, but he had another company, a small company that was in Canada, and realized that restarting something out of bankruptcy is not easy.
Yeah, especially the blended name.
Right. Well, and the Schatz name was sold off to him. The Federal name was sold off to somebody else, and so he just restarted the Schatz side of things. And my family, my father, my mom, they had a small company in Connecticut, which is where I'm from, and they became a supplier to this new venture, this new Schatz. My dad had a partner in his company in Connecticut, and they didn't necessarily see eye to eye on how to run the business. And when he found out that this guy at Schatz was looking, after a while to exit, he said, "Well, this is perfect. He'll sell his half of his company to his partner. He'll take that proceeds to buy out the guy from Canada." And so he moved from Connecticut to here while I was in college.
Okay.
So and then I already told you the story of how
The transition.
they made the transition.
Yeah, that's a fascinating story, and I think people listening, may know that the building complex that was Schatz Federal was kind of ginormous there in the in Fairview Avenue part of Poughkeepsie on the north side, and you're in a very small quadrant of that, or even, just a small section of what was that campus, and yours is north.
It is a separate property.
Oh, it is. Okay.
Yeah, it's not. It's close for neighbors. In fact, when we first started up, and people that worked at the old company there used to say, "Well, up on the hill," because we're a little bit down. That's what they didn't say the old company. They just said, "Up on the hill. This is what we did. Up on the hill."
Oh, that's funny.
But yeah, it was a big complex. We're in like a 50,000 square foot facility, and I don't know how many square feet. I mean, even the layout of the buildings there, I mean, you don't see too many manufacturing buildings that are
Right,
multi-floor anymore. The
Yeah.
buildings are multi-floor over there. And
chopped, and yeah, it's interesting. And I mean, part of the Poughkeepsie renewal is, that rail trail, which is this kind of side to is being developed and connected, and that'll be all kind of interesting. People can walk through and see that. So you're going back to the Schatz Federal, and kind of the downfall was, you mentioned this, and I'll add some layers of, macroeconomic world, like the rise of Japan, and Asian markets increasing, offshore competition, changes in the automotive industry. That was obviously quite disruptive for that company. It feels maybe not exactly the same, but it feels like there's some dynamic things happening now in the global economy. You must have offshore competition for bearings. I imagine China makes a lot of ball bearings. I imagine there's a lot of ball bearings made in Europe. Where's your niche, and where do you see the company's growth opportunities, and kind of what scares you a little bit?
well, I think it's a really interesting question, and when you think about the history over that kind of time frame, from let's say the 1970s to now, I think one of the probably mistakes that the management, and not just that's federal management, but
Oh, yeah,
all of US
universally
management,
made, pretty
They-
consistently made across manufacturing at that time, right?
yeah, they were arrogant. They had gone through a couple decades of heyday, and when you have either a country or a company that's historically, I mean, because I remember hearing, well, the Japanese just make a bunch of crappy toys. They can't do this. They can't. And underestimating your competition is probably the worst thing that you can do. You better off overestimating than underestimating.
And in any situation, anytime, no matter what you're doing.
Right. And so I'd like to think that industries are more aware of that kind of thing than they were, or even if you're a student of history. But I think that the interesting thing that's going on now is that, yes, I think if you're in a business like this, you worry about, you don't want to be in the crosshairs of what China wants to do, for example, because they for years had low wage rates. They didn't have any environmental controls. I mean, the regulations were nothing like they are here, and they made a product that could be, 10 times cheaper than what we could make. So strategically, that's one of the reasons why we're in the industries that we're in. I mean, nobody wants to fly in a plane that, is not regulated properly. We look for safety sensitive, highly regulated industries. So space, aviation, the medical markets and so forth. Their first focus is not to get the cheapest bearing, because, if something fails, bad things happen in those situations. So strategically, they are focusing in on those markets for those reasons, because you don't want to be in the wrong market, wrong being, you're up against, so ceiling fans or
Right.
filing cabinet drawer bearings or something, they're going to be, 50 cents or something. They're not
Right.
what we could compete at. So strategically, I think, that's something. But one of the things that I think is really interesting that's going on now is, and you and I may have talked about this over the years, but the reshoring that's going on. I mean, with China now very plainly stating that they're not looking to cooperate. They want to dominate the various
Right.
world,
Everything, right?
everything. If you read the literature, we're decoupling from China, and
Right.
reshoring started for manufacturing back in, I think it was 2010, and there was like 5,000 net new jobs. Last year, 2022, there was 365,000 net new jobs because of reshoring, or sometimes you hear friendshoring, where it goes to a company, or nearshoring. So, and then what's going on with Russia and there was basically the Russians, the Chinese, and a handful of other countries are kind of teams are forming. There are
Right.
a couple countries that are trying to stay neutral, but
Right.
that is really, changing my thought process. I think the last thing that some of our customers want to do is start putting a lot of emphasis on some Chinese manufacturer because of the risk that's involved. If they invade Taiwan or something, the supply chains. I mean, we even have some of our customers asking us, what is your dependence on some of these countries? Because if something goes
Really?
wrong, we want to know what your exposure is. So now it's, you always worry about something if you're in business, but that's less of a worry that China's going to come in and steal the business. And now is, what's the global security stability type of scenario that might play out.
Right. Well, and kind of picking up on that question, do you see any growth in the defense sector? I mean, do you feel like there's a lot of obvious consumption of missiles and artillery shells and jet aircraft being sent around and shot down and all kinds of horrible things that happen as a result of war?
Right.
But I assume that that's leading to some business for you.
Well, there's a few things. The decoupling from China, what's going on with Russia is changing the dynamic and what, our opportunities are. So that's one thing. The pandemic, which was really tough on the aerospace.
Aerospace, sure, yeah.
But it did expose supply chain weaknesses out there, and it's I think made some of the people that are making these decisions, the government folks, really take note of where we have weaknesses, and they want to make sure that they're not dependent on a Chinese company for something that's defense related. So that's helping us. And then, whenever there's turmoil, which there has, as a result of the pandemic, the supply chains, and it's been in the news a lot that the supply chains have had a huge amount of disruption, not just shipping, but really everything. And so what I would say is we're a small player in a very large market. And so our competitors are all $1 billion or more in sales companies, and we're the small guy. And so when you're in a scenario of turmoil and you're the little guy, that's an advantage. If you have 80% of the market and there's turmoil, you can only go down,
Right.
So the one thing that's helping us is that some of our bigger competitors, their lead times have shot way out for a variety of reasons. It could be that the defense market's really picked up and they get these rated orders that squeezes out every other order that they're supposed to be doing or they're committed to doing. So throughout this whole turmoil, and this is one of the things I said to my management team, I said, our goal was not just to survive the pandemic because it was really hard on the aerospace industry. We want to come out stronger. And I think we did, and we are, because we've intentionally kind of overstaffed during this time frame. So it hasn't helped our profitability in the short term, but that kind of overstaffing has allowed us when someone comes and says, our incumbent supplier lead time went out to 2 years. You need to find a new supplier. Can you do it? And you say, yes, we can. And, and so these are companies that we've knocked on their door for, 5-10 years. And sometimes they'll say, where have you been? And we say, well, we've been knocking on for 5 or 10 years. So.
Yeah, take my call. Come on.
Right. So, and maybe this is too long-winded to answer, but
No.
all of what's going on with China and what the pandemic uncovered as far as supply chain weaknesses, and then when you come out of the pandemic and then it seems like you can't get enough workers, that lead times shoot out. All that turmoil creates opportunities for small companies like us, and it's really helping.
Yeah, that's good to hear. And I mean, I think that's obviously really smart on your part to have that foresight and not to maybe overcut or panic when the orders weren't coming in as fast and as furious, to see the opportunity when things came through on the other side. So, you did mention staffing, and I know skills shortage, things like that, skills gap. I know that's been a challenge for you through the years. Are you in a good spot now, or is that something that it continues to be a problem?
Well, I think it's a challenge for everybody. I think it's just a degree of challenge. I think we're in a better place than the majority of some of the companies that we interact with are. It's not to say it's easy for us. I think we do put a lot of emphasis on trying to, get and retain really good people. I think especially if they fall into a category that we know is historically very hard to find, whether it's an engineering manager or a tool maker, or during those times, and I had my plant manager come to me and he said, this tool maker just became available. We really don't need him right now, but we have some Asian folks. I didn't let him finish the sentence. I said,
Yeah,
we gotta,
that's great.
So we're, but I'd say some of our suppliers have had harder times, if they either weren't in a financial position to hold on to some of their key people, or they just were, and it just was too much. They had to, because if your business drops by 50%, you can't hold on to everybody. I mean, you have to make some very difficult decisions and kind of heartbreaking decisions in some cases. But then when you come back out of that, and now business is really taking off, it's not like you can take somebody that, the people that you separated from aren't just sitting there on their couch waiting for you to call.
Right. Oh yeah, there's plenty of opportunities.
Yeah, those skills are in demand, and they just went to an industry that was not impacted like the aerospace.
Right. Sure.
So they weren't there, so they had to hire less experienced people, and that learning curve might be 3-4 years, and so it's been a challenge that way. But
yeah,
one thing I'll say, and I don't know, maybe this may not make the final, it's really frustrating, is that I don't know if the majority of people know when they see an unemployment percentage, what that means. And an unemployment percentage, when it's 5%, it doesn't mean that 95% of the people are working. It just means that it's
people looking for work, right?
People that, in the labor force. You have to be in the labor force, and if you're not in the labor force, then you're not counted. And that not in labor force number is a huge number. It's like a third of the people that are out there.
Yeah.
Yes, there's a percentage of those folks that are not working for legitimate reasons. A small slice of that is people that are looking for or pursuing education or training or something. And there's others that probably are just not suited to work for a variety of reasons. But there's a pretty good sizable amount of those people that are able-bodied people that could work, but are not working. The acronym is NILF, is the not in labor force, but then you have the NEEPs, which are not employed or seeking education or training. And those are, and there was a time study done, I've forgotten by who it was, that asked, what do you do? How do you spend your day? And probably, a typical person would work 8 hours a day. They were spending almost 8 hours a day on leisure activities. And it's not good for the person, because, to be happy, and you want to feel like you're earning what you want to be productive. And I think that's a real issue for our society, that we should not be, supporting that kind of, we should be actively trying to get some of those people who are able-bodied to not be in that situation, because that's a lot of people.
That's a lot of people, and you certainly would love to have a portion of them to get excited. I mean, it's one thing to want to force somebody into some sort of a work camp, forced labor kind of thing. But you would love to think that if they came and showed up and spent a few hours at Schatz, they would say, you know what, this is good. I could do this. This is rewarding. I appreciate it. It's good camaraderie. It's a product that is visible and out there and making the world a better place. That all makes sense to me. But once again, preaching to the choir on that one. So, Steve Pomeroy, president of Schatz Bearing Corporation, thank you very much for being a guest on the Council of Industry podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. And for everyone, this was not planned, but I also want to thank you, Harold. I know you've known you for years. I know the organization that you spearheaded for all these years, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for what you've accomplished there, the training and support that you provided to all the members, the advocacy programs that we've, the insight that we gained for going to hear what's going on in Albany. All of it has been, enriching, and I can point to success that Schatz has had, but it does take a support structure to make it all work. And the Council of Industry has been a great partner, a great friend, and I just want to, I don't get to talk to you that often, but I want to thank you for that.
We appreciate that very much, and right back at you. Your support of the association has been essential, and served as chairman of the board and been on the board for many years, and we appreciate your support as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Manufacturing Matters, brought to you by the Council of Industry and sponsored by PKF O'Connor Davies, accountants and advisors who understand the unique challenges and opportunities in the manufacturing sector. We hope you gained valuable insights and inspiration from today's discussion. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe to our podcast and leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform.